In life, sometimes we are faced with difficult choices, decisions that can change the course of our future. John, a billionaire CEO, had once lived in glory and success, but he had forgotten the most valuable thing: family. One day, while hearing a young boy's prayer at a church, John suddenly realized a painful truth: that boy was his biological son. The journey to reclaim love and forgiveness began from that moment, as John decided to face the past and start anew. The winter in New York was cold, but in the vast office of John Whitmore, the warmth of crystal chandeliers filled the room. From the window, he could see the bustling streets, yellow taxis streaking by like flashes of light in the night. Yet, in that luxurious room, amidst the expensive items and priceless artwork, his soul remained lonely. John Whitmore, a billionaire CEO of the largest tech conglomerate, a man who had everything anyone could desire: money, power, fame. And yet, there was an invisible void in his heart, a coldness that couldn't be shaken, even if he spent his entire life in this towering building. How many years had passed since he embarked on his entrepreneurial journey? During those days, he always had a clear goal: success. Everything around him could be bought, from luxurious cars to lavish parties, from beachfront villas to extravagant vacations. But one morning, as he woke up and looked in the mirror, he realized something strange: no matter how wonderful those things were, they couldn't fill the loneliness in his soul. He stood up from the expensive leather chair and walked toward the window. The scene outside seemed unchanged: towering skyscrapers, busy people immersed in their work, yet he felt nothing. Just a dull shade of gray, a lifeless city. It was hard to believe that while everyone else dreamed of a life like his, he was searching for something money couldn't buy: peace. Every day, he went to work, attended meetings, signed contracts, and met with partners. This life passed by like a whirlwind, and he didn't know where it would stop. His heart felt empty, and despite having everything, he never felt happiness. One winter evening, after a long and stressful meeting, John decided to do something he hadn't thought about in years: go to church. It had been a long time since he visited a place of quiet, where there were no phones ringing, no work demands, no congratulations or challenges. Only silence, only peace within the ancient walls. He went to St. Patrick's Church, one of the places he had frequented when he was younger. The church, with its towering stone columns and vibrant stained glass windows, always evoked a sense of holiness and tranquility. At this hour, the church had only a few people praying. John quietly entered, found a spot near the corner, and knelt down. "Lord, please help me find peace in my soul," he whispered. "I have everything, but I have nothing." The atmosphere around him was gentle and warm. But inside, John still felt an emptiness that couldn't be filled. Suddenly, a child's voice broke the silence: "Lord, please help my mom get better. I don't want to lose her. If she has to leave me, please let me meet my dad. I've never seen him, but Mom says he's a good man." John turned around and saw a boy standing in the corner of the church, his bright eyes filled with sadness. The boy was about 8 years old, wearing a thin coat, his face weathered as if he had endured much pain. In those eyes, John saw longing and hope, but there was also something strangely familiar. That feeling made him stop and look closer. The boy looked up and saw John staring at him. A moment of silence passed, and then the boy slowly walked over to him. Without saying a word, he reached up and gently grabbed John's sleeve. "Sir, can you help me?" the boy asked, his voice choked with emotion. The question felt like a cry for help from deep within. It made John's heart ache. As though there was something deeper, some connection that he couldn't quite grasp. The boy said nothing else, simply standing there, holding his hand as if seeking comfort, a lifeline. John couldn't understand why, but he felt there was something special about this boy. There was a tightening in his chest, a strange sensation, as if forgotten memories were suddenly flooding back. And in that moment, a question flashed in his mind: could this boy be my son? After the strange encounter in the church, John Whitmore couldn't forget the image of the small boy looking at him with eyes full of hope. The boy, with his sincere prayer, had stirred something deep inside his heart. Throughout the journey home, that image lingered in his mind, impossible to shake. Every time he closed his eyes, those prayers echoed in his thoughts. The boy had prayed for his mother to get better, and then, the boy had mentioned a father that John had never known. The strange feeling clung to him, inexplicable. Could it be my son? This question haunted him throughout the night. It had been many years since he had thought about family. He had chosen a busy life, focused on work, big deals, and a belief that this was all he needed. But tonight, in the quiet moments in the church, everything suddenly changed. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, John couldn't wait any longer. He decided he had to learn more about the boy. Not out of curiosity, but because of some deeper reason that even he couldn't explain. There was something about the boy that he just couldn't ignore. Some connection he had never felt before. He wasn't someone easily swayed, but this feeling was like a powerful wave sweeping away all logic. After a brief phone call, he managed to find out about the boy's mother, Sarah. The name brought back memories of a long-forgotten relationship, a love story he thought had died a long time ago. Sarah was a young woman he had met during the early days of his startup. She worked in his company, but not in a significant position. She was a janitor, a humble yet diligent job. Despite not being in charge, Sarah had a special charm, an authenticity, and a zest for life that John couldn't ignore. She had loved him, and he had felt that love too, but in the end, they had parted ways due to a misunderstanding. As he recalled those days, John realized that he had been too focused on work and his career. The promising early days had quickly been replaced by busyness and indifference. He no longer had time to care about the people around him, including Sarah. He only remembered the times she had been upset due to the exhaustion of her job or when she needed help with family matters. But he had never given her the attention she truly needed. He didn't even remember the times she had mentioned an important man in her life. Now, in John's memory, everything seemed to come rushing back. His son. The boy in the church was his son. How could it not be? The feeling was so strong, like a call from the past, a reminder that perhaps he had overlooked the most important thing in his life. John couldn't stop thinking about the boy, Daniel. Why had the boy said his mother had told him that John was a good man? The boy was his son, yet he had never known. He had never known that he had a child with the woman he had left behind in the past. Determined to find out more, John contacted one of his old friends from the company, and within a few hours, he had information about Sarah. Sarah no longer worked at his company. She had left long ago, and when he inquired about her, all he received was silence in response. But eventually, he found the address where she lived, a small apartment, where Sarah had been living with Daniel. Standing before Sarah's door, John's heart was filled with complicated emotions. It felt like he was facing something he had intentionally avoided for years. He didn't know who he would find behind this door, an old lover or a strong mother, one who had raised his son on her own without any help from him. John knocked on the door, his hand trembling with nervousness. After a moment, the door opened, and standing before him was Sarah, the woman he had once loved. She looked tired, her eyes somewhat hollow, but when she saw him, she wasn't surprised. It seemed she had known he would come. She smiled gently, though there was a deep sadness in her eyes. "You found us," Sarah said, her voice soft yet filled with unspoken meaning. John looked into her eyes, then toward Daniel, who was standing in the distance, his eyes lighting up when he saw the man standing there. "My son." John whispered, but couldn't say anything else. The feeling in his heart was overwhelming, like a tidal wave crashing over him, sweeping away all words. He didn't know where to start. Perhaps it was too late for regrets, but at least now he had a chance to do something. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with the program, we kindly ask you to leave a comment and share your thoughts in the comments section below. If you find the program meaningful, please feel free to share it to support the channel and spread its value to those around you. Wishing everyone a truly meaningful time listening. John stood before Sarah's apartment door, his heart pounding as if a great door in his life was opening. All his emotions were packed into this moment: anxiety, fear, regret, and hope. This was the first time in many years he had faced Sarah, the past he had left behind. Everything inside him seemed to explode, memories of a time long gone. Feelings that seemed to have been asleep, suddenly coming back to life. Sarah invited him in without saying anything more, just gently leading the way. The apartment was not large, but it was cozy enough to feel the warmth of a family. The objects in the house, from hand-painted pictures to the small dining table, exuded simplicity but were filled with love. And there, in the corner of the room, a boy was sitting reading a book. Daniel. The scene hit John like a slap to the face. The boy didn't resemble anyone, yet there was something very familiar. The boy's eyes, those eyes, John recognized them immediately. Those eyes were a part of him, sharp but also filled with sorrow. The boy looked up when he heard the door open, and Daniel's gaze met his. Without saying a word, just a moment of silence, but within it, all the complex emotions were clear. "Daniel, do you remember me?" Sarah spoke, breaking the heavy atmosphere. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared at John, as if trying to figure out who the man in front of him was, and why he was there. After a while, the boy stood up and walked towards him. "Are you my father?" Daniel asked, his voice soft but full of doubt. The question hit John like a shock. It was a question he had never expected, but one he had been asking himself all night. At that moment, the answer didn't just come from him, but from the very emotions within him. He couldn't ignore it, he couldn't pretend not to know. John froze. He couldn't answer immediately. Every word choked in his throat, and in that moment, he felt guilt, a sense of incompleteness in his life. The child he had never known stood right in front of him, and all he could do was look at him, unable to touch, unable to apologize, unable to do anything other than feel a profound sense of regret. "Am I your son?" John stammered, his voice catching, as if this question could not escape his lips. Sarah looked at him, her gaze filled with sadness, but also a hint of understanding. She had prepared for this moment for a long time, but she couldn't be sure if John could accept the truth. "Do you remember, John? It was that summer, when we first met. Our love was beautiful, but then you chose work, you chose your career. You left me alone with this child." John felt a violent wave crash through his mind. Old memories suddenly flooded back, as if large stones had been lifted from the surface of the water, revealing cracks and memories that had been buried for so long. He remembered the days with Sarah, the times they laughed together, the plans they made for the future. But everything changed when he realized he couldn't stop for love. Work, career, and big ambitions pushed him further away from Sarah. Did you know, I never thought about family. I only thought about work. And then, when you left, I thought I could forget you, forget everything. John's voice broke, unable to hold back his emotions. Did you forget us? Sarah said softly, her voice gentle but carrying a deep hurt that only those who have loved each other could understand. Did you forget us, Daniel and me? John stood there, lost in the weight of his own guilt and regret. He had no words left to say. His gaze slowly drifted back to Daniel, the child who stood in front of him, his bright eyes filled with hope, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, some confirmation that John was indeed his father. I don't know. I never thought I'd have a child. I don't deserve to be your father, John whispered, as if confessing a deep sin. His voice cracked under the burden of a truth he couldn't face. But as he looked into Daniel's eyes, something inside him stirred, a recognition that this was his chance to make things right, to repair the mistakes of the past. Sarah watched John quietly, her eyes reflecting a complex mix of emotions. She wasn't angry with him, but the hurt from the past was still there, lingering like an open wound. She knew that, through all those years, she had faced every hardship alone. But now, standing there with John, she felt a shift. She wasn't alone anymore. Daniel needs a father, John. I can't replace you. And you can't replace me. But at least, we can be parents to this child together. The light from the window poured into the room, creating a warm glow that seemed to symbolize hope. John looked at Sarah, then at Daniel, and in that fleeting moment, he realized the most important thing: the past could never be changed, but the future still lay ahead. And he had a chance to start anew. After the tense conversation in Sarah's apartment, John couldn't shake the thoughts of everything that had transpired. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, reverberating like the sound of something that had been buried for far too long, now suddenly coming back to life. He stood at the window, staring outside, but the scene beyond couldn't calm the turmoil inside him. He had everything a man could desire: money, power, fame, but why, when facing his son, did he feel like he had nothing at all? John had always prided himself on his ability to control everything, but now, standing there in front of his son, he realized he could not control his own emotions. Confronted with the truth that he had missed an entire life of a child, he felt a deep, aching sorrow. He couldn't turn back time to start over, but at least, he could do something now, for Daniel and for Sarah. That night, John couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying everything that had happened: Daniel, Sarah, and the wrong choices he had made in the past. He wondered if there was any way to make up for the losses he had caused. But one thing was clear: he couldn't continue living the way he had before. The next morning, John made a decision. He would visit Sarah and Daniel, not to seek forgiveness, but to prove that he was ready to change, ready to be a real father. Sarah's apartment still held the warmth he had felt the first time. When John knocked on the door, this time Sarah didn't seem surprised. She knew he would come back. She understood that life didn't change easily, but there was something sincere in John's eyes now. Sarah opened the door without a word and invited him in. John looked inside, where Daniel sat at the dining table, focused on his homework. The boy didn't notice him at first, but when he heard the door open, Daniel looked up, and his face lit up with a smile when he saw the man standing there. "Uncle, you're here?" Daniel asked, his voice still innocent and filled with surprise. John nodded slightly, his heart tightening with a strange feeling. He knew he had never been a father before, but now, he could not turn away from this responsibility. Every gesture, every word from the boy made his heart feel as if it were breaking into pieces. "Are you okay?" John asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Daniel nodded, but then looked down at the table, seeming unsure of what to say next. Daniel's shyness made John feel guilty. He knew that, over the years, the boy had lived without the love and care of a father. But he also understood that rebuilding this relationship required patience. This child was not an easy gift, he was a part of him, and he needed to do everything he could to ease the boy's pain. Sarah stood beside, watching John and Daniel. She didn't say anything, but in her eyes, there was an understanding. She knew that Daniel needed time to accept John's presence in his life. But she also knew that, if John was truly determined, everything could change. "I've thought a lot about this. Sarah," John began, his voice soft. "I know I was wrong, but I can't keep living like this. I want to start over. I want to be a father. For Daniel, for you, and for myself." Sarah looked at him, then sighed softly. She knew that this couldn't be changed easily with just words. But at least, she could feel the sincerity in his voice. "We can start over, but not today," Sarah replied, her voice gentle but resolute. "Daniel needs time. You and I do, too." John understood that. He couldn't rush things. He had to accept that this relationship had to be rebuilt step by step. And the first step was to show Daniel and Sarah that he was willing to change. The next day, John began to change. He didn't return to work immediately. Instead, he spent time with Sarah and Daniel. He started doing small tasks around the house, helping Daniel with his homework, going shopping with Sarah, and even cooking dinner together. As each day passed, John felt himself growing closer to Daniel. The boy began to smile more, began to accept his presence in his life. Although he couldn't yet call him father, John knew that these were the first steps to rebuilding everything. Sarah gradually began to see the changes in John. She no longer felt the old wounds, but she couldn't forget the mistakes of the past. However, she realized an important truth: although the past couldn't be changed, the future still held the possibility of a new beginning. A week later, Sarah invited John and Daniel to the park. It was a beautiful day, the air was fresh, and everyone was cheerful. Sarah looked at John and smiled gently. "We can't change the past, but at least we can move forward with a new hope." John looked at Daniel, then turned to Sarah. He took Sarah's hand and said, "Thank you. Thank you for giving me this chance, thank you for not giving up," Sarah replied. And the three of them walked together in the sunlight, in a peace they had never known before. That day, it rained. The raindrops gently fell on the window, creating a gloomy atmosphere, as if John's mood mirrored the gray sky outside. Although in recent days, he had spent a lot of time trying to rebuild his relationship with Daniel and Sarah, he still felt a gap that couldn't be crossed. Every step he thought brought him closer to them seemed to be followed by something that pulled him back. Daniel, the boy who was growing every day, could feel the changes in John. However, he still hadn't fully trusted him. The old wounds were too deep, and for Daniel, accepting a father he had never known was not easy. As for Sarah, although she had begun to open her heart to John, she still couldn't forget the difficult days when she raised Daniel alone. She understood that John was trying to change, but the painful past still cast a large shadow in her heart. She was afraid that if she opened her heart too soon, she would be disappointed once again. Nevertheless, Sarah couldn't deny that John was changing. He started to get involved in their lives, spending time with Daniel, helping with small tasks around the house, and showing genuine concern for the boy's feelings. But those actions weren't always enough for Daniel to feel John's sincere love. The boy still kept his distance, still didn't believe that this man could truly be a father. One late afternoon, after returning home from an important meeting, John received a message from his assistant. A major project at his company, one he had invested a lot of time and effort into, had suddenly encountered a serious problem. The partners had backed out, and the company's development plans were now under threat. His heart weighed heavy, and worries about work began to overwhelm him again, but this time, John didn't rush to solve the problem immediately. He stood before the door of Sarah and Daniel's apartment, his gaze directed toward the rain outside. Even though the company was facing difficulties, what he felt at that moment was far more important: he needed to be with his family. And this time, he knew he had to do something different. When he stepped inside, Sarah and Daniel were sitting together on the sofa, a familiar sight that John had not had the chance to see in a long time. Daniel was reading a book, while Sarah sat silently, her eyes reflecting concern. "Is everything okay?" Sarah looked up when she heard John's footsteps. She noticed the worried expression on his face, and for a moment, that feeling of unease surged within her again. "Not yet, the company is facing a big issue," John replied, trying to hold back his emotions. "But I can't let it overshadow the more important things in my life." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness. She knew that the company meant everything to John, that it was the reason he had forgotten the other important things. But this time, she also realized that money and fame couldn't solve everything. "You're trying very hard, John. But sometimes I think you don't realize, love and family need presence, not just what you can bring from work," Sarah said, her voice gentle but full of sincerity. She wanted John to understand that only true sharing and companionship could help bind this family together. Daniel looked up, glancing at both of them. He remained silent, but his eyes showed an unspoken worry. He didn't know how to feel about John. He knew he was his father, but love wasn't always that simple. "Can I go for a walk, Mom?" Daniel suddenly spoke up, breaking the tense atmosphere. Sarah nodded, and Daniel stood up, hurriedly running outside. Once he stepped out, only John and Sarah remained in the quiet room. The air between them seemed to thicken, as if no words could resolve the unspoken things. "Sarah, I know I've made mistakes. I can't change the past, but I want to start over. I don't want to lose what I have now," John said, his voice choking. He had prepared for this moment for a long time, but now, facing it, he realized he needed to confront the deepest truth. "You can start over, John. But you have to understand that not everything can be easily fixed. Daniel needs time to trust you, and so do I," Sarah replied, her eyes meeting his with understanding, yet also with concern. John stood up, walked over to her, and gently said, "I'm not expecting you to forgive me immediately. I just want you to know that I'm here, to be Daniel's father and a better man in your life." They both sat in silence for a moment, but then, looking into each other's eyes, they felt the change. It wasn't perfection, but a sincere promise, that they wouldn't give up. That evening, John once again sat next to Daniel while the boy did his homework. Even though the boy still hadn't fully accepted him as his father, at least he could sit beside his son and share those small moments. And that was the first step. As time passed, it seemed that the relationship between John, Sarah, and Daniel was gradually improving. After work, John always made time to help Daniel with his homework, take the boy to the park, and cook simple meals with Sarah. However, despite everything appearing to be fine, deep inside John, there was an indescribable sense of anxiety. He knew that he hadn't fully been forgiven. Although Daniel had started calling him Dad during intimate moments, sometimes the boy's gaze still held doubt. Sarah hadn't fully opened her heart either, and that made John feel like he hadn't truly achieved full acceptance. One autumn day, when the golden leaves began to fall along the road, an unexpected event occurred. An emergency meeting at the company where John had spent his entire career building pushed him into a tense situation. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The major investments and projects he had staked his faith in were now facing a crisis. This sent John into a state of panic. He felt an emptiness in his heart as he realized that everything he had built over the years was about to crumble, but this time, he could no longer avoid those feelings. Faced with the collapse of the company, John realized he had to make a different decision, a decision that could change everything. The next day, John came home late, his eyes tired, and the traces of a never-ending battle were evident on his face. Sarah and Daniel had already gone to sleep, but he still couldn't find peace. He sat down on the couch in the living room, silently staring out the window where the dark clouds still hung, symbolizing the storms that were waiting to hit. Why is this happening? John wondered. He had done everything to get what he had, but now it felt as though he had lost everything. No company, no career, and seemingly, no way to regain the love of his family. A small noise woke him up. Daniel was standing in the doorway of the living room, the dim light from the hallway casting a faint glow on his face. The boy was still awake, and his eyes looked at John with deep concern. "I see you're upset, Dad. Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice soft, as if afraid to shatter the tense silence in the house. John looked at his son, and a feeling he couldn't describe surged within him. The boy, the one he had missed for so many years, was now the one closest to him. It seemed Daniel had an uncanny sense, an understanding of what was happening that adults sometimes fail to recognize. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm just thinking a little." John tried to smile. But the smile only deepened the sadness in his heart. Daniel stepped closer and sat down beside him. He didn't say anything else, just sat quietly and listened. It was a special silence, full of comfort. Although he had never been good at expressing his feelings, in that moment, John felt a true connection with his son. He felt that he could start over, no matter how difficult everything might be. The next morning, Sarah woke up and found John sitting in the living room, his face marked with determination. She walked over to him and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "I don't know what you've been facing, but I can see you're exhausted," Sarah said, her voice full of concern. John turned to look at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "I've made a decision. I won't let the company go bankrupt. But more importantly, I won't let my family slip away." She looked at him in silence, sensing the change in John's words. For the first time, Sarah felt sincerity not just in his actions, but also in the promises he made. "What will you do?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but full of trust. "I'll sell what I have, not for the company, but for the family. I'll start over, rebuild from the ground up. Whether it's the company or the family, I will do everything to make both strong." Sarah looked at him, then gently nodded. She knew, in this moment, John had truly understood the value of what he had, not money, not power, but family. That day, John called an important meeting with the shareholders. He decided to cut all unnecessary projects and focus on what truly mattered. Although this decision could cost him a lot, he knew it was a necessary sacrifice to protect the ones he loved. Despite the difficulties and challenges ahead, John no longer felt the anxiety of failure. He knew that, even if the company collapsed, his family was the only thing he could never afford to lose. That evening, their family sat down to dinner together. Daniel no longer sat far away. Instead, he pulled his chair next to John, chatting happily. Sarah smiled as she watched them, her heart warmed by the realization that, even though they hadn't completely overcome life's challenges, at least they were moving in the right direction. They had truly come back together, facing all the difficulties side by side. John took Sarah's hand, then turned to Daniel, saying to him, "I promise, I will never abandon you again. I will do everything to protect this family." Daniel smiled, an innocent smile full of trust, and for the first time throughout this journey, John felt a peace in his heart. Things weren't perfect, but at least, he had found the most valuable thing in his life, his family, and so, the challenging journey of John, Sarah, and Daniel came to a meaningful end. After all the pain, sacrifice, and tearful moments, they finally found harmony and true love. Their story wasn't just a journey of forgiveness, but also a reminder that family is the only thing that can overcome all hardships. How do you feel about this story? Please share your thoughts and feelings below this post, so that we can all find valuable life lessons together. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share and subscribe to the channel to not miss out on other inspiring stories. Thank you for watching and supporting.